Great. So my name is Fionnuala Delan, and with Matt Poland, if you want to give a wave there, Matt. With Matt Poland, we're going to continue with our race and imperialism workshops for 2021-2022, which started last May with Dr. Megan Custer, and her talk is up on our YouTube channel if you want to have a look at that. And today we're delighted that Dr. Vaibhav Singh is joining us for this session. Vaibhav is a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Typography and Graphic Communications in the University of Reading, where he recently completed a 3-year British Academy postdoctoral fellowship. His project, Merchants of Alphabets, Networks of Typographic Design and Technology in Indian Language Publishing, 1900 to 1950, addresses the impact of typographic design and technology on the linguistic diversity of Indian publishing in the decades leading up to the country's independence. Now, Vaibhav's work situates typographic design in a critically under-researched area in publishing and book history within the intellectual framework of nationalism, mass communication, and technological modernity. And Dr. Singh is the recipient of an RSVP Kern Award for 2021, of which we're delighted. Now, one of the key things, I suppose, is that these workshop series bring to an RSVP, a Research for Victorian Periodicals audience, and the wider community a broader sense of what it is to be working in Victorian studies or to be working in the 19th century. And a key feature of the workshops is to introduce us to new ways of reading periodicals and to reading new periodicals. So we're continuing that widening of the field and the deepening of the field that has been happening in Victorian studies over the last number of years. But we channel this through the lens of periodicals and the materiality of periodicals. So it's fantastic to have somebody who works in design and typography. Much of our organisation is kind of heavily weighted towards literature and history scholars and art historians. So it's great to have the design perspective and this kind of the way, focusing on the way in which periodicals are made. So Vaibhav is going to talk for about 20 minutes or so. And we do invite you to put any questions you have as Vaibhav is talking into the chat, and if intervention is needed or if we're going to stop and discuss and clarify points, we'll be keeping an eye on that chat. And then there will be plenty of time at the end as well for questions and for interaction around the material that Vaibhav is discussing. So we're delighted that you're all joining us today, and I'll hand you over now to Vaibhav. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Delan, and I'm really glad to be here. And I would like to begin by thanking RSVP and for organizing this. And I hope to keep this very informal, actually. So please feel free to kind of interject if something is unclear or you have any questions. Please put them in the chat, and we can. If it's something urgent, we can always pick it up. So yes, let me start by, again, thanking RSVP and also thanking the British Academy and the Willison Charitable Trust, as well as Bibliographical Society for funding a lot of the work that actually has been interrupted during all the sort of disruptions of last year. So I must begin with a certain disclaimer that this is work in progress, and it's really kind of been disrupted since the travel that is necessary to access much of the periodicals that I'm really talking about hasn't really been possible. But nonetheless, I think the discussions that I'm hoping to have today with you are going to be more interesting to me from the point of a work in progress. So please do kind of put up any questions or comments that you might have. So let me just begin by looking at the 2 or 3 different aspects that are implied in this title. The first notion of obviously having trans-imperial technological networks, which sort of involves also imperial networks, not just ones within India and Britain, for example, but also things between the networks of technological sort of collaboration between very specific areas. So I'm talking about Western India in this context, which is the Bombay region in the 19th and early 20th century. And also the general period that I'm talking about is sort of the 1880s to 1930s, very broadly. So there are various periodicals that I am hoping to look at further that kind of give a much clearer sense of the trajectory of certain debates that happened during this period, because this, I'll come to why this particular period, but that's the sort of general placement of the things. So the project that I'm working on is to sort of examine the debates around technological change conducted in the Marathi periodical press of this particular period, the late 19th and early 20th century Bombay region. And particularly debates that use the mechanization of the newspaper and periodical press itself as a point of departure for talking about larger, questions of technological change, modernization, things like that. So in doing so, um, the my project hopes to explore the connections between late Victorian reporting of technological innovations in the British and American press, and as well as, in particular, and trans-imperial networks that were initiated by local publishers of Marathi newspapers in and various other Indian languages, but I'm concentrating on Marathi periodicals at this particular moment. So, just to kind of bring it back to the main point in discussion, which is the materiality of language and script, which is in printed, when talking about printed communication, is often characterized as a technicality rather than as an aspect that's closely related to questions of agency, power, political negotiation, and the material concessions required to actually produce a printed document. But I'm interested also in exploring how the infrastructure of typographic design and mechanical composition at this particular period, which is the turn of the century, constituted what may be called a socio-technical encounter, something that fed into particular communal and linguistic agendas at this time in Western India, and how it facilitated the flow of information, but at the same time imposed several constraints on it at the same time. So that's actually a very interesting encounter that happens in from the point of view of history of technology, for instance, where the sort of general narrative has always been one of transfer and of imposition, for example. But looking at the periodicals of this time, you see a really interesting engagement, local engagement with questions of technology, with in fact solutions, with a kind of a public discourse around questions of technology and particularly the printing press. So just to kind of give you a quick background, printed communication is indeed realized through conceptual infrastructures of script, such as the general frameworks of alphabets, syllabaries, ideograms, which are very different in their framework, and material infrastructures of production as well, which is, for example, if we look at metal, if you're looking at handset type, stone, if you're looking at lithography, and of course pixels, if you're looking at digital ways of communication. But there's also social infrastructures of practice, which is, of course, represented in skilled labor networks of technologists and people who are actually making and producing manufacturing. So the period between 1880 and 1930 presents a particularly rich instance of negotiations between various writing systems, which is different than language. It's the sort of graphic element of the writing system, and the typographic infrastructures of the periodical press in different languages and scripts. So it's useful to think of infrastructures as the underlying framework of power relations as well, as a system of putting in place and controlling different socio-political, economic, and technological worlds. And to bring infrastructural qualities into focus is to pay attention to material and conceptual systems that tend to be characterized often as invisible and rarely scrutinized. And nowhere more so, I think, than in typography, which is famously described as the crystal goblet, which, sort of is just a sort of, it takes the shape of the communication, so to speak. But there are, of course, these are systems that, and infrastructural systems that determine ways in which text-based communication can or cannot take place, in which particular language periodical is produced, for example, and which script, and with what level of ease and accommodation is that actually possible. So beginning in the 1890s, the technology involved in producing newspapers went from being pieces of metal cut by a punch cutter, cast by a type founder, and then hand set by a compositor, to pieces of metal cast and set by mechanical means. So here you can see a demonstration of a much later demonstration, obviously, of a punch cutter at work who's cutting, individual letters of type as punches, which are then used to strike matrices, and then that produces, these sorts, which are, individual letters that are put together one by one to form lines, and then impression taken from it forms the sort of, the printing aspect of it. So one of the key things to understand here, obviously, is that printing, or the history of printing technology, often kind of conflates all of this together into a single, phenomenon, which is, of course, useful as a sort of general idea to kind of simplify all of these different processes, but is also sort of misleading in some senses, because these processes that are behind each of these systems of printing, because printing, lithographic or letterpress or digital or photographic, is very different things. So the processes that go behind each of these things has a history, which has sort of, histories of agencies and of histories of sort of conflicts and sort of concessions, which are really interesting when we start looking at them. But as I was saying, this is the sort of system that we have at the turn of the century in production of the periodicals, and it changes very quickly. In the 1880s, we have, things like typewriters coming in, so mechanization is something that is kind of on the horizon. And we've got the linotype, which is a sort of mechanical typecasting machine at an industrial scale. And here you see an example of what happens when we think of the change in terms of the production before the printing, before all the processes that go before the printing actually change. The printing itself doesn't necessarily change. It's still impression printing. So we are still talking about newspapers and periodicals that are printed, inked and kind of taken impressions from a raised surface. But the idea of actually having individual letters, the alphabet, the font, the typeface, all of those things that happen in handset type are entirely different from the processes that happen here. So for example, it goes from being a craft, something where you had, apprentices spending years to kind of learn that craft and hone it and sort of get speed, change from that to a sort of a precision engineering related thing, where you see letters being drawn for the first time in great detail, and then patterns formed from that, and then mechanically reduced to form these punches. So this entire system, of course, is a sort of the background, the invisible, processes that are behind the printing of these periodicals. So, of course, mechanization promised increased speed and efficiency by changing some of the key elements in the process of printing itself. So instead of picking and setting type by hand and redistributing it in cases after use, a compositor would now sit at a keyboard and a machine would cast and assemble entire lines of type. So machines like this, for example, where you would sit at a keyboard and be able to sort of mechanically tap out the text that's supposed to be composed, and it would still be sort of composed mechanically. There's still going to be metal involved here, but instead of actually having an individual one by one picking and manually setting type, the machine is actually doing the job for you. And of course, the entire lines of type would be kind of set up and could be reused because they could be melted after use and recycled without having to be redistributed. So one of the key points here is also in relation to scripts, because when we talk about all of these technological changes and mechanization in general, we are still sort of not really looking at the sort of the infrastructure of script, which is very different. By which I mean, if you look at alphabetic script composition and syllabic script composition, an example of which is illustrated here, you would notice certain differences. I mean, of course, the idea that an alphabetic composition is, a very clear, neat, one thing next to the other, setting allows for a certain kind of speed, allows for a certain kind of possibility in setting type, which is not the same as a syllabic script where you have different requirements. So the process of setting type in an Indian language here, in an Indian script rather, is basically a form of adaptation of a technology which is primarily suited for alphabetic production. So that obviously leads to a number of difficulties in, in practical application, of course, but also in thinking about how, for example, histories of technologies are framed. Questions in histories in the history of technology are often framed in terms of, why did the adaptation of movable type, why did it not catch on in certain places, or why did it take so long for the printing press to be accepted? And these are sort of, questions that are coming from a presupposition that the technology is something that is actually useful and favorable. So here's an example of how technological innovation is not necessarily an improvement, where even if you don't read the script, you can probably tell that there's a certain level of sort of, disorientation and breakup happening in, I think, the one on your right. I don't really know what the orientation is, but yes, you can see there's on the left hand side is a sort of hand composed text, and then on the right hand side is mechanically typeset on a line composing machine, which is a liner type, so it's composing entire lines of type, and there's obvious limitations there which give a certain kind of an appearance to the text, which is not favorable, and which is not necessarily doing it any benefits. So that's the sort of general context, but we're looking at sort of the rapid growth of literature, nationalist literature, and periodical press production in this particular period in Western India and across the rest of India as well, in the form particularly of weekly, bi-weekly, and sort of later more frequently issued periodicals. And these had sort of spurred new considerations for speed and efficacy of periodical publishing in Indian languages. Now, this led not only to the development of certain kinds of alternatives for handsetting, type for Indian scripts, but also to orthographic and typographic revisions in text composition in order to sort of simplify, things, so to speak, for the technology. So this is a kind of a counterintuitive process of actually adapting the script to the technology to make it easy to produce text. So arguments have been made for more modern and linear typography, both in quotes, from 1870s to I think even today. The idea of being able to type text in a particular script is a very different kind of a phenomenon, which, once the keyboard is introduced at the beginning of the 20th century, it really starts to sort of homogenize the infrastructures of scripts everywhere. So we are still, for example, thinking of writing or sort of inputting digital text through a keyboard, which is clearly a sort of a limited, device to kind of input alphabetically rather than actually allows for more characters. So that's just an example. But this what that meant was that um, a certain amount of experimentation of the script itself began to take place in the periodicals, and that made Marathi periodicals in particular really interesting during this period for this the level of experimentation that went into this. Um, so yes, at the various sort of machines to mechanically typeset English language text had already been introduced at the turn of the century, and the development of machines for Indian languages was something that became quickly a sort of a prospect that was entertained by local periodicals proprietors. So these periodicals carried latest reporting on mechanization in Victorian Britain and America, and systematically invited local responses to such endeavors. And the most enterprising actors in, sorry, is that a question or?
Sorry, could I just remind everybody to stay on mute, please? Sorry, bye, Bav.
No worries. If you have a question, do please feel free to jump in. So, yeah, the most enterprising actors in the majority of these cases were obviously printers and publishers of periodicals who wanted to increase circulation and reach a larger public by producing a greater number of newspaper copies, but also institutions of a strongly nationalist orientation, which is really an interesting dynamic that appears at this point in time and something that I would come back to. And from the mid 1880s, local newspapers and periodicals in the Bombay region start sort of postulating, discussing, and debating the much anticipated developments in sort of mechanizing the periodical press. And across the span of at least 3 decades, this happens in a really intense period of activity, especially in the sphere of Marathi printing and publishing. And much of this public debate involved political figures, but also inventors, educators, and simply the members of the literate public who were able to kind of interact through the means of letters to the editors, for example, or writing a response to an editorial through the periodicals to be able to participate in this larger debate around technology and its place in modern India. So this was a debate that allowed various different kinds of perspectives to be sort of to appear in print, and different people to kind of grapple with the pros and cons of industrialization and technical education and the mechanics of presenting a response through a modernized vernacular press that would connect larger agendas of literacy, political activism, and a homegrown culture of invention and innovation becomes quite a key factor here. So Bal Gangadhar Tilak, a prominent nationalist leader whose newspapers you're seeing here, who co-founded two of these really influential newspapers, the Maratha in English and Kesari in Marathi, had initiated typographic experiments that led to a certain measure of standardization and simplification in the composition of types. And because of the sort of relatively large circulation of these newspapers, it warranted an importation of machines to print it, and these experiments were actually possible at this particular time. So experiments were also made in this connection relating to the casting of a new kind of Marathi type, which I just showed you here, which is sort of early experiment, not very clear, unfortunately. And this set in motion a new era for local entrepreneurship, spurring on Indian inventors. For example, here, the Biso type by the Indian inventor Shankar Bhise, who produced this casting and composing machine initially to sort of experiment with composing text in Indian languages, but this wasn't a machine that actually found traction at all, and it remained a sort of a prototype in the end. So Kesari had advocated technical education for Indians on the whole, and industrialization of the country, as well as the quote-unquote modernization of the periodical press from an early point in its history, when its circulation figures were actually fairly modest. Now, while it operated under the banner of militant nationalism, in the face of an increasingly vigilant state censorship, its own sort of case for technological education in India and industrialization derived precisely from a nationalist stance that envisioned advancement of its cause through technological parity with other nations of the world. So, in a sense, the initiation of transnational networks becomes something that is part of this entire sort of debate. To what extent is the place of a sort of imagined Indian nation at parity with the technological state of various different other nations of the world. And it's really interesting because um, newspapers and periodicals then start forming an increasingly significant space where arguments for and against technological interventions on the whole, but also in the periodical press in more concentrated fashion, could be both extended and debated, and then public opinion around such issues could be rallied and created. So a host of local periodicals which I am particularly interested in is are um, Vivid Gyan Vistar, Masik Manoranjan, Marathi Gyan Prasarak, and Indu Prashad, which constituted a kind of a site for active local engagement with the question of mechanization, as well as the desire for what they sort of presented as the indigenization of technological knowledge, which is an interesting kind of understanding of their sort of response to um, the reporting of, for example, inventions in Scientific American, which is cited quite widely. So the arguments for industrial and technological training, which are extended routinely in these periodicals, are also interesting precisely because they're in this idiosyncratic space where the nationalist ideology, which actually is quite anti technology at this particular moment, is flexible enough to pursue the goals of mechanization in collaboration with imperial and trans-imperial entities in what is largely an overlooked but vitally important engagement with technology at this particular moment. So reading smaller Marathi periodicals reveals how material production of newspapers and periodicals itself became the crucible for debates around modernization and mechanization. For example, here this is a very sort of the last example of the Marathi newspaper Sakal, which is kind of culminated in the sort of the inauguration of the monotype machine to set Devanagari in 1932. And the newspaper account, which actually has text composed in this new Devanagari typeface, is actually set by hand. It's not really mechanically composed, but the idea of actually being able to accomplish something with the collaboration of the Monotype Corporation in London is something that is publicized widely, despite the sort of reservations that are otherwise expressed in the editorials about collaboration with the imperial, entities. So this is something that becomes really interesting in even smaller newspapers where the difference of opinion and the kind of messy history of ideological struggles, but also these sort of technological experimentation become a lot more evident. And the idea of actually having the idea of actually being able to trace the development of these trans-imperial networks becomes a lot more possible in the smaller newspapers rather than the ones that are driven particularly by ideological congruity. So, for example, newspapers like this, which is Chitramaya Jagat, which translates to Illustrated World in some sense, and others like Karmanuk, which is or Masik Manoranjan, which translate into entertainments, which are not necessarily sort of politically driven, are nonetheless really interesting sites to kind of explore how the entire ideological stance towards technology at this particular moment is decentered through a very, very grassroots engagement where a number of people are able to actually chime in on the debate of how to mechanize the periodical press. And several of them actually begin um, through these letters to editors and writing editorials for such periodicals, from being writers to being experimenters and innovators who actually then connect or form networks that then are able to sort of engage with uh, you know um, sort of manufacturers in Germany, in America, particularly at this moment, and to kind of actually initiate these projects of mechanization with very very local agendas. So that's actually a very interesting aspect of these small newspapers. And for example, here you see one such particular example where this is a particular the head of the princely state of Ichalkaranji, who actually funded the the travel of the person who went to London to experiment with the monotype mechanization, had actually connections with Denmark and the trade collectives there, which he brought to the town of Ichalkaranji, which is current day Kolhapur, in relation to the technology of textiles. And here's just an example of that. And this same network, sort of, which is a very very local network driven by very very different agendas, then ends up being, through these small local periodicals, ends up being a kind of a site where multiple kinds of technological projects could actually take place, and also technological education of certain individuals could be funded, for example. And this was all very, very deeply communally oriented. So here's just an example of, how technology was not just a matter of kind of um, sort of, a very positive attitude towards it, but it was also a very communally driven notion, where it was seen sometimes as something that's sort of only connected with a specific branch of or community that is pro-government, or which is kind of collaboration with the government, which would be deflated after. So I mean, this is a sort of a joke here that's kind of putting Muslims against Hindus in a very very sort of localized agenda, presenting this as a sort of a collaborative adventure which will eventually fail when the sort of air runs out. So there's all kinds of different ideological misgivings, but there's also sort of variation of opinion and expressions of interests, which are not the same in more sort of mainstream newspapers or larger newspapers, which are much more editorially sort of congruent. They don't necessarily have a wide variety of kind of opinions within them. But these sort of small Marathi newspapers actually present a very rich view of the interactions at multiple levels: local, regional, national, imperial, global. And they point out the variety of actors and geographies that are involved in investigating the similarities, discordances, and tensions between these different levels. So here's an example of how the periodicals are actually looking at the example of Russia, and elsewhere they're also sort of citing the examples of Mexican Revolution, early 1910s, for example, where they're looking at the role of the periodical press itself in kind of looking at societal change. So this is where I think I will probably stop, and hopefully that's kind of given you a sense of how the periodical press and its kind of networks that are behind not just the sort of textual production, but the actual material production, had a pretty sort of major role in actually exploring all of these questions of technology, modernization, and also politics, communal politics within it. So yeah, I think I'll stop there and open for questions.
Thank you so much, Vaibhav, for that absolutely fascinating talk that really brought together so many kind of layered strands in terms of thinking about what we actually mean when we say trans-imperial in a very kind of concrete way, like, and literally very material way as well. Because I think the kind of conceptual approach that these various terms like trans-imperial or world systems approaches or post-colonial approaches, all of those very theoretical systems, do provide us new lenses, obviously, to look at material, but in thinking about it in its materiality and in foregrounding the infrastructure and questions of design and questions of invention and questions of creativity that are particularly happening at local levels, I do think it offers us important kind of examples of how we move away from either top-down approaches to thinking about transfers of knowledge, and also to moving away from purely, I think, the kind of limitation sometimes of a broad world systems theory that overemphasizes a kind of a monolithic capitalism, which I think some of the local examples you're talking about challenge. But we have a big audience here, so I would like to ask people to engage with some of the questions that Vaibhav has raised for us. You can do this in a number of ways. You can put your question into the chat. You can use the reactions button to raise your hand, or you can